Okay, so Lorem Ipsum is the ubiquitous filler text that you find on websites. It's what web designers use while they're waiting for clients to, write some content. And when I decided to do a talk on this, I thought I would maybe touch a bit on the history and then do some funny stuff, maybe spend a couple of minutes laughing at companies that still have lots of Lorem Ipsum text on their websites for years and years and years. This is the privacy policy from moneysupermarket.com, reassuring. I thought maybe I could talk about how it's been adopted by the creative industries. There's a surprising number of people wandering around with Lorem Ipsum tattoos, for instance. And maybe talk about how it's got quite an ironic status these days. So for instance, Chipotle, I think I'm pronouncing that right, used it on one of their bags recently and got lots of lovely media coverage as people trying to work out whether they'd done it on purpose or by accident. So when I was putting together this talk, I thought I'll just do the history quickly. But looking into that, came to a bit of a stumbling block. Because if you check on the internet, it will try and convince you that Lorem Ipsum has been around since the 1500s and has been in constant use ever since. This is Microsoft telling us that very fact and telling us that it was developed as a way of showing off a font without being distracted by the actual content. Since the 1500s. I thought this sounded a bit weird, so I did the only sensible thing and I Googled it. I put the word Lorem Ipsum into Google and checked book search and found out how often it appears in writing. Not very often until the end of the 20th century. So if you look closely, we can actually see that the first real takeoff is in about 1973. There's a small little blip there in 1914. What happens in 1914 is that we get a translation and a new edition of a work by Cicero. Because of the pagination of it, when they looked at it, they discovered that on the top of the first page it says Lorem Ipsum quia dollicet amet. Interesting fact, lorem, not a Latin word. The Latin word is dolorem. The do is on the previous page. So this is the first evidence we have ever anywhere of Lorem Ipsum being used, slightly later than the 1500s. In case anyone's wondering, this is a translation of that part of Cicero. I don't know whether this has anything to do with the fact that people keep tattooing it on their arms or not. Anyway, when we compare the Cicero to the Lorem Ipsum that we know and love, we see that they're similar, but they're not actually identical. So we've got the Cicero on the top, Lorem Ipsum on the bottom, and it looks to me like someone's kind of tried to neaten it up and made it look a bit less weirdly Latin to somebody who speaks English, so it's less distracting. So again, we're thinking 1500s? Because 1500s, we're talking very, very early printmaking. And at this point, not a great deal of competition for fonts. Who are these people showing around these lovely fonts they've designed? And where were they doing it? Because most of it was happening in Europe and Germany and in Italy. And if you were literate at that time, you spoke Latin. The first real English font master we had was a chap called William Caslin. He started working in the 1700s, so we're about 200 years out on the whole 1500 date at this point. So it's getting a bit weird. There were people obviously making fonts in the 1500s. This is a chap called Aldus Manutius, or something like that. He was fairly significant. He invented italics, and he formalised the use of commas. He was working in Venice. He also donated his name and his face to a piece of software in 1984 called Aldus PageMaker. First desktop publishing program, first time most people come across Lorem Ipsum, which is probably where this date of 1500 comes from. But it doesn't tell us where Lorem Ipsum comes from, because that's popping up in 1973. So we have to get back to before desktop publishing, and we start looking at layouts and typography, and people sort of putting together things, which was all done by hand before you had a computer. And we have a thing called Greeking, which is where you take a text or something and fill it in there so you can't make it legible, hence it's all Greek to me. And if you were doing this at all and you didn't have a computer, you probably got your hands covered in Letraset at some point. These transfer sheets to stop you having to do, writing out everything by hand. And if we take a closer look at the back of this catalogue, what we can see is that it was actually produced in 1966. And you can just about make out, there it says Letraset body type, you can almost make out, it says Lorem Ipsum dollicet amet. So that's 1966, which is the first documented source of Lorem Ipsum being used as filler text. How it got from 1914 to 1966, still a mystery. Interesting to me and about 6 other people, so here's some interesting stuff. Here's some alternatives to Lorem Ipsum that you can use. There's Bacon Ipsum, Vegan Ipsum, Gangster Ipsum, Hipster Ipsum, and that's Bluth Ipsum, which is quotes from Arrested Development. If you're being more serious, we have Filarati, which will take sort of sections of text from classic literature. That should be a font called Block, which isn't showing in this, which normally takes out the letters, so that really doesn't work on this. And of course, Ed Bull's Ipsum for special occasions. But I think really the testament to how Lorem Ipsum has developed its own mythology is there's nearly 9 million pages on the internet that rather than actually use Lorem Ipsum filler text, They've just copied the page about Lorem Ipsum and are using that as filler text instead. Thank you very much.